It's great to be here. I can't say how much I enjoyed talking to people during the cocktail reception. So many friendly and sympathetic and people. So many of you I've met before, but it's a little, I had somehow. You have a bad experience working next to the United Nations and dealing with some of the people you have to deal with, and I don't. You have a tougher job than I do. I will stipulate that. But somehow in the last 2 or 3 months, I got myself, I don't know, into the role of debating various people on the left before various Jewish and Israel-interested audiences. So it's literally true. In the last 3 months, I have debated David Saperstein before the biannual Reform Jewish conference, and David Saperstein is the most, is their hero, and so there I was trying to defend various conservative principles and criticize gently President Obama before his base, Reform Judaism, and then this was about 2 or 3 months ago in Washington. Then about a month ago, I debated Barney Frank before the American Jewish Committee, and that was a little better, and went okay. And then last week, I agreed to come up here to New York and to debate at B'nai Jeshurun and at BJ up at 88th and West End, the synagogue my daughter's in-laws belong to. Jeremy Ben-Ami, who's the head of J Street, an organization that I don't normally deal with much because they're so irrelevant actually in Washington, which is a good thing, and have been so discredited. But that was really the Upper West Side of New York. You forget I grew up on the Upper West Side of New York. I grew up at 81st Riverside, but you really forget what the Upper West Side of New York is unless you've been there recently. And that was really quite an experience, I'd say Jeremy Ben-Ami was sort of was the moderate compared to the audience, which was some of the audience. Some of the audience was fine. So anyway, it's extremely nice to be here tonight after these last 2 months, and it's nice to be in such a wonderful place, the University Club, which I've been in a few times, and I do think there might be some founders of the University Club rolling over in their grave at this particular group, the Glatt kosher appetizers. The University Club has a long tradition of that for generations, I'm sure. It's a beautiful place. I don't know how many of you have been here, but I've actually had lunch here a few times. It was a friend of mine does belong. I was on the 7th floor of the dining room. Really, it's almost worth stopping off on the way down on the elevator to take a look. It's one of the greatest, architectural rooms in New York, I think generally considered to be designed by McKim 100 years ago, and it really is a fantastic space and worth looking at. Plus, it would be a little like a Woody Allen movie to have a lot of people with kippot, getting off the elevator and descending on the people dining there. It has a certain comic possibility, Anyway, I'm a great fan of what David and Simon and all of you have done and made possible with the Allgemeiner. And I want to say a word about the media. I think Shachar really captured that very well, the importance of this new moment in the nature of the media and its implications for the state of Israel and for Zionism. Then maybe I'll say a word about American politics, since people seem to be interested in that, and allegedly that's what I do for a living. So, on the media front, I really do think there's a lot of nostalgia sometimes for the old days somehow, when there weren't all these bloggers and all these different voices, and when people couldn't write outrageous things and then get them picked up on other websites. But in fact, the old days were not such good old days, honestly, if one really thinks back to them in a serious way. And there were some good moments in the old days, but there were a lot of really terrible times when the Protocols of the Elders of Zion managed to get around the world, and anti-Semitism managed to have a very good run, unfortunately, if I can put it that way, in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And that was before the internet and before bloggers and before modern media, and probably was made possible in some ways because you couldn't, of course, fight. These lies really could become accepted and propagated by well-established organs. Not so much in the United States, of course, which is this is a very different country from, thank God, from many of the other countries Jews have lived in and been expelled from and been persecuted and killed in over the centuries. But still, it does remind one that for all the frustrations of modern media, I do think we're in a much better situation now than we were 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. Certainly 27 years ago I came to Washington, and I remember that vividly. The monopoly on information that the New York Times basically and the three networks had. It's almost inconceivable today. When I go to college campuses and say that when I was in college, you could read the local paper. You could get I went to Harvard, so Boston had more, out-of-town news was the newsstand in Harvard Square, which was very exciting, but you could actually get out-of-town newspapers, which was kind of unusual, And so you could get the New York Times as well as the Boston Globe. You could watch the news at 6:30 or 7 p.m. at night, 22 minutes on CBS, ABC, or NBC. It was pretty much identical, all produced from here. Now, at that point, mainstream liberal media were somewhat pro-Israel, so from an Israel point of view, it wasn't so bad, but that was going to change reasonably soon. And that was it. There was no other way to get information. There was you could get a radio news update on breaking news every hour for 5 minutes on CBS or whatever. But there was no talk radio. There was no cable channels. And for all the criticism of talk radio and for all the criticism of cable news, and there's a lot that deserves to be criticized, it does provide a diversity of viewpoints, access to a whole lot of other information that you don't get if you just have the 22 minutes on the evening news and 1 or 2 newspapers that you can get your hands on. And then the internet obviously changes everything. And I would say, as someone who speaks a fair amount of college campuses where the orthodoxy is not, from my point of view, politically very healthy, and certainly from Israel's point of view, is not very healthy. One of the great things is the access to other points of view. I mean, I'd say when students are being nice to me, they say, we love being able to read the Weekly Standard online. We love be able to read, articles that you've had by Elliot Abrams, or we like to be able to read Charles Krauthammer's column this week. And I tell them, you couldn't have done that when I was in college. I mean, you physically couldn't have done it. Maybe if you subscribed, I guess, to a magazine. How many college students do that? Or if your parents clipped something and sent it to you. But otherwise, that was it. You didn't have, and if some professor is teaching a course, that was it. That was your whole access to understanding what was happening in the Middle East or anywhere else. So in this respect, it is a huge opportunity, insofar as the major institutions of the media and the academy are not what they should be. I think most of us would probably agree, in terms of teaching the truth, teaching history accurately in a balanced way, making sure that students are exposed to all reasonable points of view, insofar as they are slanted in a certain way. And this is a particular problem, obviously, in the academy, I think, with respect to Israel. We should really welcome the diversity of viewpoints at the end of access to information that the web, the internet makes possible. And this is why what David is doing is so important. It's important for fighting the political battles, and it's important for fighting, just educating the public in general. But for me, having just had 3 kids go through college and now in their 20s, I think getting to young people in this way is really an important thing. And there are many other places that do it too, but Al-Gabbaid is a very important part of this, and I really think, and I'm optimistic for that reason, incidentally. I really think the environment in that respect is better, the ability to correct lies, the ability to educate people also, not just to correct lies, but to actually point people to things they should read that are longer than, correct a particular misinformation about the day's headlines, but then say, but if you want a deeper understanding of what's happening here, read this longer article. And it doesn't have to be an article that was published this week. It could be an article that was published 20 years ago in Commentary Magazine, but there it is online, and if someone recommends it, you can link to it, and you can read it, and read this book, by Ben Zion Netanyahu or whoever, and here's a link to that, and you can order it from Amazon. I mean, the ability now to really fight the war of ideas in a fairer way is very encouraging to me, and I think very important. The moment on Israel, I'll just say one word on the media. I don't know if this may just be my own personal experience. I'm not sure that I'm accurate at saying this was an important moment. The moment when I realized that the modern media structure, which for me fundamentally is the internet, I would say, the immediate accessibility of information, the ability of people to go online themselves, of bloggers to compete with the mainstream media. The moment I saw how powerful a tool that could be for the sake of Israel, for the sake of telling the truth about Israel, was in 2002 at the moment of Jenin. As you remember much better than I do, the incredible distortion of what was happening in Jenin when Israel had to go in and try to finally deal with the terrorist problem that had really gotten out of control, obviously by the spring of 2002. And The Guardian and on the New York Times were printing just unbelievable things about massacre there. And my memory of it, and I haven't gone to check this was pretty, it did some damage, but actually it was checked much faster than it would have been 10 or 20 or 30 years before. The lie could not sit out there for months or for years on end and then be corrected finally by an article 18 months later somewhere when people had forgotten about it and had assimilated the lie. And it was corrected pretty quickly by people writing on the ground, from IDF soldiers, civilians, a few journalists, freelance journalists, people who just went out there and said, there was no slaughter of innocent civilians here. There were some deaths, but here's why they happened, and here's in fact, rules that the IDF followed to prevent many more deaths, and here incidentally were killings obviously by terrorists. And I do think that for all the frustrations one has with the media these days, I mean, that is an example of how even though the New York Times and the Guardian and CBS and others wanted to perpetrate a kind of modern version of a Protocols of Elders of Zion, it really didn't succeed because of people on the ground reporting what really was happening. So I am generally bullish and optimistic on the new media with respect to Israel, especially in the circumstance where large parts of the old media and the established media and the established universities are not very friendly. So that's all the more reason, I think, all the more important and timely are efforts like Allgemeiner. Let me say a word about, I also like Allgemeiner because my grandparents were big fans of Der Tag, which I remember going out. My grandfather died, and when I was 13, actually just before my bar mitzvah, and after a few years, my grandmother moved in with us from Brooklyn to the Upper West Side, and one of the jobs, I don't know if you could or couldn't subscribe to the Yiddish papers, but somehow we didn't. We could have afforded to, I think, but somehow we didn't actually subscribe. So one of the tasks I had walking home from school on the West Side was to stop at the newsstand and buy a couple of Yiddish papers for my grandmother to read, because she was still more comfortable reading Yiddish and enjoyed it much more. And so we read Der Tag. She was a big Der Tag reader, is my memory of that, and which then went out of business, but was sort of succeeded by the original, I guess, Allgemeiner, which you're now the successor of.